Sup everyone, Red Pony Podcast here. We're starting a new 3-part series today where we go over the new Resident Evil trilogy. Recently, Josh and I were just thinking of all the crazy possibilities for Resident Evil 9 when it comes out. I know that's a little ways away, but you just can't help but want to speculate. And we decided to make a video on it, and the way we're going to do it is that we're going to start from the very beginning. We're going to start from Resident Evil Biohazard, and get subscribed, because after this episode we're going to do Village, and then we're going to do an extra episode on speculation. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, why are these guys talking about a 2-year-old game? I believe.
I am wondering that.
Are they morons? Yes.
Yeah.
But on top of that, the reason is because we really think that this trilogy is important. It's important because it re-sparked the flame for survival horror games to be in the public eye, good survival horror games. And it's been a while. I think for any survival horror fan, you know there's been quite a drought until these games came out. Especially within their own franchise. The Resident Evil 5 and 6 were not good. It really started to feel like the end. We got the Silent Hills trailer, and that didn't happen. And then out of the ashes, we get these new Resident Evil games. And I think they exceeded expectations. They are more than just good. They're a statement piece, every single one of them so far. And yeah, we're just going to start with Biohazard, pretty much. So yeah, we're doing it because this is a return to form in survival horror, and I want more survival horror to be made, and this is a pinnacle of it. So I think we're going to start off by talking about I think, one of the most insane intros in gaming in Biohazard, pretty much. And I'm going to leave that to Josh to describe that conundrum. So, yeah.
Let me just implore your intro. Well done, well said, and let's get started. So, with the story, which is our first point, I think me and you should have a chat about, is just, like you said, this intro that we're met with in this game is just mind-blowing. It is a non-stop train ride of exorcism and gore and disgust and perfection. It's wonderful. So I think by way of brevity, I'll just kind of brief you guys, if you haven't for somehow, maybe you've been living under a rock, but essentially you start by trying to find your wife, girlfriend Mia, start traveling towards this abandoned house that's out kind of in the country someplace. You realize it's locked up, and then you try to get around the back. You start seeing some creepy things are going on. You see a van that's been kind of left, that's rusted over. You see some dead deer. You get round back, get into this house, and then you start to see these tapes eventually. You start to see the other guys that were here. And you start to see that some guy's dead and he's downstairs, and you go down there and he's dead. And then you're just suddenly like, you're transported to this point where Mia's in the house and she's coming at you with a chainsaw and your hand's off. And then for somehow you're trying to like, my hand's off. And then you're like trying to shoot her and she's coming at you with this fucking chainsaw. And then she's going to kill you. And then you kill her. But do you? No, you don't. And then that is a start. And my heart was just pumping. By the way, I've probably missed 20 different things on that point. Like, it's so much that happens within the first half an hour of this game. I've got to tell you, Pete, I haven't played many games with an intro that's so captivating. I haven't done it. And this is actually like one of my very first Resident Evil games. So I'm a newcomer to the genre, to the field. And I've only played Resident Evil remakes 1 and 2. So I was absolutely blown away. It's first person. This whole start to this story is just amazing. So the star is there. It goes on, of course. Pete, do you want to just add anything to that? Just
yeah, no, I completely agree. I think you did a good job of capturing the frantic nature of the intro. But yeah, Thank you. Many insane things happen within a very short period of time. I think it's very clever how, although it's a trope, I think it's clever how Mia has this dual personality thing going on that you don't expect, and how you kind of have to, grow some balls and protect yourself from her, and that involves killing her. Well, you think you kill her, but you actually don't. I also, at that point in time when I played it, I couldn't believe that she actually cuts your hand off. For a while I was like, is this going to be a mechanic where you have a prosthetic, where you actually just don't have a hand for the rest of the game? But then the biggest BS in the whole franchise pops up with the healing juice, where you stick your hand back. And
yeah.
I like it, though. I think it's the perfect...
Reminds me of the Far Cry thing, where it's like, oh, damn, I've been shot in the head. Let me just pull out this little bit of wire. It's fine.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just,
I like it. I think it's charming. I think it's a cool, campy little trope.
So then after all of that load of shit has happened, you're then met with a nice group of fellas sitting around a table, eating corpses. Welcome to the family, baby. You're in for a ride. it's the most interesting start to a fucking game when how can things get worse, you ask yourself, Pete. And I fucking realize shit can get worse because you've got a lot. This basically is the premise for setting up the entirety of the story. The whole family's out to get you. You're imprisoned in this chair at the start. They're eating eyeballs. They're trying to force feed you. They're biting you. They're ripping off your limbs, whatever they need to do, essentially, to scare the shit out of you. And then from that point onwards, you're then into survival mode. That's where the game kicks off. But the story progresses where you have to then take each of these family members on to try to save Mia and get the hell out. It's a simple premise, and it works very effectively because actually you know exactly what you're up against, but at the same time, you just don't understand what their powers are. You know they're going to be terrifying going down. And, Jack's the first guy. You've got, is it Marguerite, the terrifying crazy lady after?
Yeah,
You've got
yeah.
the grandma around there. And you got the brother dude. What's his name?
Lucas.
He's terrifying as well, but Lucas. And he's less terrifying. He's more of a nuisance, as we'll discuss later. But that's the story, Pete.
So as Josh said at the beginning, we are splitting this episode into talking about the pros and cons of the story, of the mechanics of the game, and of the just general atmosphere and setting. In terms of story, we don't believe that there is much that can be talked about in depth because it is a very simple, very classic Resident Evil story. It's in a way a return to form. It ditches all of the antics and shenanigans of Resident Evil 5 and 6, and it goes back to something that is ultimately very simple, has no bells and whistles. It's a story about a person looking for a loved one while trapped in a terrifying and oppressive, closed and claustrophobic space. That's what it is. And across as the story continues, you find out that Umbrella Corporation is involved, and there's a cover-up, and there's some corruption going on, and of course, the thing that is causing all of this insanity is a virus. That's the story, pretty much. The only thing is that the only interesting part of the story is the addition of Evelyn, which is the little girl, and it adds almost like a supernatural element to the story. That is by far the most interesting part of the story. And this is not an issue. We believe that ultimately this story is the perfect foundation and springboard, or sandbox, so to speak, for classic Resident Evil survival horror to happen. It puts you in, it propels the story forward in a way which is very effective for the game.
So we start with the film crew. They're investigating the abandoned house. And after that point, we're greeted with the family. And you kind of get to understand the main villains that you're up against. And then you and I have come up and coined a term called the Arkham setting, which is kind of where each of their villains take place in their own remote area of the map. And the story on which it takes most of the story, which you will be taking and enjoying, is basically going to each specific part of the map and trying to defeat them and doing any necessary narrative points with them. Then the kind of story takes a bit of a U-turn, a switch, and you go to Mia, and you get a bit of backstory about this abandoned ship, the shipwreck, and it's about investigating and trying to sort out a puzzle. And after that point, there's the climax, and we get the ending. I mean, that's a real general overview, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the most important part to consider about the story, this is kind of design, but it's also the way it impacts the story, is, as we said, the Arkham setting, what we are calling the Arkham setting. The reason we are accruing this design is because we believe that the Arkham games, the Batman Arkham games, are the best example of this type of philosophy, design philosophy. But ultimately, the point is that there's several villains that you have to tackle. In this case, it's Jack, Margaret, Lucas, Evelyn, and they all have their own sides of the map, and you find out more about the story in each side. And of course, all of those settings, visually and thematically, kind of embody their personality and their character, and it feels like delving into into the psychology of these maniacs. Yeah, that's basically how the story is structured. And this is, once again, we believe that the Arkham games are like the poster child for this design. That's why we're calling it that. Just wanted to clarify.
Would you agree with me if I said that it's such a predictable yet unpredictable game?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. The story and the direction it ultimately goes is very predictable, but the journey is unpredictable. I think that's the way I see it. But
I think that's actually how I mean it exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And it's just, you can rest aside the fact that the story may have these predictable qualities, to say the least, because you are met with such a great sense of discovery along the way that it just works perfectly with this in tandem story and gameplay.
Yeah. So I think we can move on to the good stuff now, which is the mechanics of this game.
Okay, so the first thing that I would like to talk about with you is crafting. Now, the game doesn't have an in-depth crafting system. I would say that crafting really is simply about finding the gear that you need to survive. It's about crafting ammunition, it's about crafting health, it's about crafting supplies. But there's always a lovely balance in Resident Evil where it really tries to limit the excess supplies you have, but at the same time force you to explore everything on the map to find these supplies you need. I wanted to quickly just have a short question with you, Pete. Just do you think that the game is over or under in terms of giving you resources? What would you say?
I'd say that, especially by comparison to previous Resident Evil games, it's perhaps a little bit too generous.
I think I'd probably agree with you. I always found that I had an abundance of health and ammunition.
Yeah.
Although playing Village, this game actually feels quite restrictive comparatively, because Village it's like you've always got ammo. It's much more freely available. But nevertheless, crafting is a mechanic that you're always faced up against. The most, I'd say, absolutely beautiful thing that this game does well is backtracking.
Mm-hmm. What makes the mechanics special in Resident Evil Biohazard is that it is not only a return to form atmospherically when it comes to the survival horror genre, it is mechanically as well, in the sense that it brings back traditional elements, which is inventory management, crafting, backtracking, and just the brevity and impressiveness of the level design and exploration in this game. And backtracking is part of this whole world design, level design thing, where the map in itself is almost a character. The map is something that you need to conquer. It's a puzzle on a large scale. It's always there. You always feel its kind of influence on you and the choices you make in the game. The map is, like I said, like a really large scale puzzle that you need to crack, and you have to figure out where you are in that puzzle chronologically. You need to figure out what items you need to use to unlock this area of the map and to achieve what you need. It's problem solving in its purest form. That's what is so excellent about the design in this game. And it's one of the few games where backtracking is not annoying, because it always like adds a different perspective to areas you've already been to. It's making the same areas ultimately feel fresh throughout the whole experience. And that's just survival horror goodness. Yeah.
Well, it's lucky actually, because it's kind of like hunt or be hunted. It's this survival genre that actually is able to pull off this backtracking thing.
Yeah.
If you put it in many other games, it doesn't work because it's kind of like tedious. But
Yeah.
with this, it's the immersive nature of being there in the present, still trying to gather the clues and the items you need. So it does work.
Mm-hmm.
Good point. Yeah. It's almost like you have danger at every corner as well that you're contending with.
Yeah.
Which is another mechanic you have to muster with, especially with Jack chasing you around in the atrium and stuff.
Yeah, that's what makes it even more special, is that not only is there a pretty elaborate and intricate environmental puzzle you have to solve whilst you're solving that puzzle and figuring out how to progress in this game, there's danger. You're in danger at every corner, as you said. And that makes it even more tense, because not only are you using your brain to figure out how to progress in the story, you're also a little bit afraid of moving forward. So
yeah.
It's like this cycle which propels you, in a sense, which is excellent.
Yeah.
And on top of that, a mechanic that helps with that, in my opinion, is the inventory management, which is classic survival horror, where you find items out of order sometimes, and you may not need an item until later. And inventory space is limited, so you need to know what item you need at that particular moment in time. You need to know how to conserve your ammo, conserve everything you need, and use the storage box appropriately to advance. And particularly in the hardest difficulties, you really need to consider it. That's why this is one game where I think an easy difficulty would completely wreck it, because the whole point of it is that it is challenging, and you need to use your brain to move forward. It is entirely dependent on you. In conclusion, for this first section of mechanics, inventory management, crafting, backtracking, level design, and mission design, coupled with danger at every corner. Yes.
And let's not forget that Resident Evil, in typical Resident Evil fashion, should we say, is the puzzles. And there are an abundance of reasonably varying puzzles with some interest, actually. There was a particular one that I can't forget, which is kind of like a saw room where you actually have to... You almost have put into this environment where you really have to think yourself through multiple scenarios. And you have to guesswork and pick up certain objects, destroy balloons, and try to work out how to escape.
You're talking about
under the
Lucas's area, right?
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yes, and it's the most far-reaching puzzle where there's multiple stages to it. But even with that set aside, there are multiple puzzles which are at least somewhat interesting. It's clear that they put more effort into the puzzles than, let's say, other games, where you have to rotate objects to find representations of objects in shadow form, and there's a puzzle with an infection vial, a virus puzzle. Sorry. There's a puzzle at the start with the shotgun, which is just a really nice little touch where you have to try to find something to replace the weighted object. There's a lot of varying things you have to do alongside this danger at every corner, this inventory management, this constant chasing and running around and backtracking.
Yes, it makes backtracking feel like discovery, which is it's almost like a trick, but it's a very good trick. So now we shall move on to another mechanic, which is very important in this game, which is the combat. But the combat is actually very good, which is a new thing in my opinion. Well, not new. It was introduced with Resident Evil 4, good combat, and it's been brought back now with Resident Evil 7. It is much simpler than 4. It is more in the vein of if Resident Evil 1's combat was good. That's my opinion. But I think that everything is executed very well in terms of the diversity of the guns, as well as the feel of the shooting. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I'd say it is a real challenge to shoot the damn zombies and kill them in this game.
Yes.
Not only, obviously, it doesn't take 4 shots, it takes sometimes 6. You can there is a skill ceiling that you can get to, where mechanically you feel like you're getting better at it.
Yeah.
You can start to understand how the zombies move. But that being said, they are unpredictable. And that is a charm, really, because it does set this apart from other zombie games and other games where you have to kill anything. As there is almost an element of risk to even every encounter. If you think you could get away with using your pistol, you might die, or you might take a hell of a lot of damage.
Yes.
It might be best to use your shotgun. There's a bit of almost in the back of your mind micromanaging what is the best approach to each situation. And also, I like how in the boss fights specifically, I'm thinking of like where you're facing against Marguerite especially, you really have to use the best sources of weapons you have. So it brings back all the prior mechanical stuff we talked about. It's like about the management. It's about do I have enough resources? Should I shoot this or should I not shoot this? So there is a emergent component to this gameplay. I think you're going to talk on this, but it's just where even though it's on rails, there's a weave of unpredictability in there.
Exactly.
And so much mechanical stuff that you really have to kind of premeditate things and think things. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? There's a thing there. Like it's a bit more to it.
I think that this already introduces one of the most exhilarating and interesting parts about this game, which is I know how this sounds. I'm going to say the illusion of unpredictability. I know that sounds bad, but it's not a bad thing. It's just Jack appears and hounds you, and you have to escape him. And ultimately, there's a little environmental puzzle that you need to solve. You need to figure out, you need to grab a key from somewhere and then enter the basement and then come out and basically figure out how to traverse the terrain while being hounded and constantly in danger. And the thing is that a lot of things happen along the way that get triggered where something crazy happens, like Jack just bursts through the wall when you think you've managed to escape right in front of you, and then you have to go the opposite direction. And there's plenty of things which seem like they happen in an emergent fashion that are unpredictable, but that are actually ultimately very linear, because there is only one way to solve this environmental puzzle, and they do it in such a way where it's so intuitive and so obvious that that's how the puzzle should be solved, that it feels emergent. It feels unpredictable. It feels like dynamic, even though it's not. And I think that's fine for a game like this, and I think that actually takes a great deal of expertise and artistry to make something that is ultimately scripted and linear to feel unpredictable and dynamic. And that's a recurring theme throughout the whole game, especially as far as Jack is concerned. Every interaction with Jack has this element which feels dynamic to it and emergent, even though it's really not. And I think that's really cool.
That's so true, because when you face Marguerite later, even her scenes, and when she's roaming around the old house and she's trying to find you, even though it technically is to some extent scripted, it really does feel kind of emergent and like it's happening live.
Yes.
It almost feels it's almost adding so much more to the immersion and story that it makes it so much more terrifying.
Yeah.
And it works very well. And the story that you need to get to we need to talk about in short now is essentially when you're in the basement or in the garage. Sorry,
Yeah.
and Jack he just basically comes out of nowhere, slices that fucking cop in half, motherfucker. Jesus Christ, with a spade or a shovel or a pitchfork, whatever. Yeah. I think it was the spade. And you quickly realize at this point that Jack is not to be fucked with. And then there's this whole escapade with the car, which is cool, so cool. And then you have to try to you contest him to try to get in the vehicle, and then you ram him into the walls, ram him, and you kind of feel like you're done with him. But obviously that's not the case, as we'll see.
It's a very cool subversion of expectations, kind of, in that you have this thing where you're gonna meet up with a cop, and the garage door opens, and it's like freedom, it's escape, and
yes,
you know that it's not actually escape because it's so early into the game, but the situation is so tense that you still kind of wish it were true. So it's like this weird melange of emotions, even though you know that cop is gonna die the moment he opens the garage, which he does. And yeah, once again, the whole emergent aspect of it is very prevalent in the garage boss fight, because there's a lot of things you can interact with. You can interact with the car, and there's a few variations based on if you interact with it before Jack can get his hands on it, or after. And so either you have to ram him, or he takes control of the wheel and he drives into the wall. And once again, ultimately, you're just interacting with linear scripted events, but it feels dynamic, because the game it puts you in a suggestible state where you're like, it feels like you made the choice to do that thing, but really the game just guided you there. But it feels like it came from you, which is what is special. And once again, it's this whole insanity, which I find the most interesting about the villains in Resident Evil Biohazard, is the fact that they're almost immortal and they can do these crazy things with their bodies, and there's almost like this mania and this twisted sense of humor to them, which I think is really cool. How he drives into the wall and crashes the car with him in it, or he's on fire and he just doesn't give a fuck, and how I didn't expect at the end of the boss fight, because he keeps on coming back a few times through the boss fight to scare you, and I thought that was really effective. And at the moment where you think you actually did it, of course he gets back up, and he has a shotgun, and you expect him to shoot you in the face, but instead what he does is he blows his own brains out with the shotgun. And it's just, everything is so crazy and backwards that it's just a wild ride in that first act. So, yeah.
Certainly is.
And finally, going back to the point that Josh was making about the unpredictability when it comes to actual combat and gameplay, that is a really clever way of subverting the natural lifespan of a game like this, which is eventually you'll get so good at it and have played it so many times that you know the map by heart, you know where every enemy is, and you can technically cheese it, right? On paper. You can just run through, owning the whole mansion, knowing where everything is. But the way that they counteract this, they did this in this game and in the Resident Evil 2 remake that they were going to make later, where the zombies, they kind of move around in ways which are unpredictable, and there's an element of RNG to their placement, which means that you can't necessarily just cheese the game and run through all the time, because sometimes the zombie might move in a way you didn't expect, and you deal quite a bit of damage on the harder difficulties. So once again, adding to longevity, etc. I think we discussed all the important parts about mechanics. And now let's move on to the good stuff. I think the truly special part about what makes this game great, which is our dear atmosphere and setting.
And this gives us that opportunity, the classic Red Pony thing, where we can talk about stuff almost in a literary sense. We can start being poetic as we were,
Sure.
So I'm looking forward to this. Now, should we just try to describe this game in a few words at first, and then start to break down each point by section of the game?
Yeah, I think that's the.
I
Best way to do
find
it.
I find this game is very hard to describe, at least without having a thesaurus next to me in terms of the atmosphere.
It is easier to describe than Village, though. I think that's for sure. But I'll throw some words out there. I think what miserable and demented. That's how I would describe the splash of paint this game has.
Yeah, I think miserable is a great word to describe this. Yeah, you are in a hell of a miserable situation. It's also extremely repugnant, dirty,
Yeah.
unsanitary. It's a grotesque environment. It's a grotesque game.
Yeah.
So if we break it down, let's discuss the atmosphere at the dinner table. I'd love to hear what you think about that one, because that is just something I can't get out of my head. You know, if you're trying to get someone to play Resident Evil Biohazard, just describe. Let's try to Pete. How would you describe the dinner table? Goodness. Goodness.
You're referring to the intro scene where you're at the dinner table.
I am.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a combination of things where there's this almost, backwards Alabama Americana thing going on where there's characters which are, I don't want to say anything too mean, but the whole inbred backwards type thing they're going for, but they're also merging that with the virus, where there's an element of disrepair and something disgusting and unsanitary to everything on top of that. Whenever I think Resident Evil Biohazard, I think of that brown sludge and stuff like that. And adding cannibalism on top of that is just the cherry on top, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a perfect way of putting it. I'm not gonna. What I will share with you is my thoughts on as we said in the start, on the story, the Arkham setting, where the map has its requisite sections to each character. So each character kind of emotes their own atmosphere to their setting. And you've got a infestation with Marguerite. You've got a bug problem, to say the least. You've got a woman who is I'm trying to think of how to describe her demeanor. She is the atmosphere that she evokes, at least in the old house, and it is, again, damaged, old, broken. But she herself is menacing. She is relentless, and she is bloodthirsty. But she's just like a seething. What's the little insect called? It's the thing that suckers blood. She reminds me of something of that nature. She is just
a mosquito.
Relentless, really. She is.
Yeah.
Either a mosquito or a leech. I was thinking.
Think that Marguerite is the scariest villain in the game. She's terrifying. Everything about her. The fact that she's so mobile all the time. The fact that once you reach the old house, she's omnipresent. She's everywhere. It really.
Yes.
Everything feels claustrophobic when you're around Marguerite. And what I think is really clever is that you're actually in an area which is far more open in the greenhouse when you fight Marguerite than when you fight Jack. But it feels much more closed in when you're fighting her because of her mobility. And I think what adds to that is the fact that she has that terrible high-pitched voice that screeches, and she has the manic laugh, and it just feels like
there's like a bit of a gruff to her voice as well.
And it feels like she's always just right above you or behind you. You never feel safe when you're close to her. It feels like she'll pop up out of somewhere and just she's really sends shivers down your spine. That's for sure. But we should go back to Jack and talk about the very first area in the game, which is the main house. And I think what's cool about that first area before you exit into the Arkham setting is that it has a much more of a focus placed on it. It's just Jack. Jack is the person you're scared of and the one that you encounter constantly throughout the house. You have the bathtub part, etc. And you really feel underpowered throughout that first section. You feel like you're out of control and you're just barely scraping by and surviving. And until the very last boss fight, well, not the last one, but the last one in the main house with the chainsaw, where you defeat him. And until that point, it felt unfathomable that you could defeat these immortal beings, in a sense.
Yes.
They felt like almost like something that you should always run away from. But in that final boss fight with Jack, you feel empowered because you suddenly defeat something which seemed undefeatable before. It's almost like a Souls-like feeling. You overtook the odds. And then once you exit
Very true.
Yeah, because you felt claustrophobic. And not only that, once you exit into the outside area with the trailer, not only do you feel like you have this weight that is taken off your shoulders, you also exit outside into an open space, which is a visual aid to the thing that the character is feeling. So, though that intro bit atmospherically is very effective, in my opinion.
Should we do each character one by one?
Yeah.
Would you like to do it that way?
Yeah.
Yep. So I think I'd like to talk more so about the grandmother rather than Lucas, because I find her much more atmospherically intimidating and more interesting and more nuanced. She, as I'm sure you'll know, is that through a large proportion of the game, she just kind of stalks you. She just kind of rolls around in a wheelchair off camera, and she kind of, well, not even necessarily stalks you. I find that oftentimes she's not even looking at you, but she's in the room somewhere. And this happens many times. She's in the atrium, in the top upstairs landing. She's just in the corner. In the master bedroom, she'll just be next to the secret entranceway to that underground area. And of course, there's the whole part at the end. But besides that, she evokes this serious kind of like, it's almost like Mr. X. But instead, she has, you don't understand what her powers are. It's just, she doesn't obviously relay any kind of information of what she intends to do or what she is to you. She's mute, as far as I remember, and
paralyzed.
It's just terrifying.
Yeah.
And paralyzed. Okay, that might explain the muteness, but nevertheless, she is just absolutely freaky. Because, well, first and foremost, if she's paralyzed and mute, why is she moving? How did she get up the damn stairs? Is something I was wondering for ages. Mm-hmm. Like, it is freaky as fuck, and I think it works even more well because of the fact that she is with you, like, all of the time, in some sense. She's with you at the dinner table. She's with you when you first get into the atrium, into the master bedroom. Again, she's just kind of in the background. While Jack is in the foreground, you can't escape these guys. It's terrifying.
Yeah. And there's a reason why she's always there, is because she's actually the main villain, kind of the game. And going back to Marguerite's area, the old house, I think one of the most effective scares in the game, it made me, not literally, but it made me shit my pants. And it's the fact that I did not expect a very specific element of this game. I expected a whole virus thing where all the characters are manic, etc., because we've seen that before. But in Marguerite's area, especially when you first start playing with Mia, there's this moment where not only are you scared of being caught by Marguerite, you're going through this crawl space hiding. Suddenly you hear, "What are you doing, mommy?" from a little girl. And that just scared the shit out of me because that's a little ghost girl. At least it seems that way. And I just did not expect an overtly supernatural element to appear in this game. I feel like it's really clever to have the horrors seem to be tied to this virus in classic Resident Evil fashion, and then introduce what seems to be a completely supernatural element on top of that. Of course, it being like a little girl is perhaps a little bit uninspired, but I still found it very effective. And I found the reveal was predictable, that the grandma is the little girl. I thought it was pretty nice. And I think it's really interesting. Once again, you have the classic understated tragedy of Resident Evil, where there's this little girl that's a test subject, and she lost her parents as a result of it, and she's basically just had a terrible life, which is, I always find it interesting that they get into this really depressing and serious subject matter of like abusing text subject, but they gloss over it, and but whatever, still. So moving forward, we're going to talk about the testing area now. So that's Lucas's section, and this once again harkens onto the whole theme of empowerment, in that Lucas does not even feel like a scary boss anymore. He feels like a nuisance that's just in your way. And I thought that was really well executed. And in this section, it's, as we stated earlier, has a bit more of a Saw feel, in that there's traps and elaborate puzzles that you need to solve to escape, and kind of beat Lucas at his own game, pretty much. Lucas has a very type of, Riddler type personality, the characters who think they're smartasses and they put everything at stake. Yeah, I think this section is atmospherically pretty good. I like the whole, the testing area, the whole neon-y, jilted thing it has going on. And it's fun to put yourself up against Lucas. That's what I think about this area. It's kind of the final piece in this whole Arkham setting thing we were talking about, this area, before we expand into the Mia section, etc. So.
Probably would say it's the weakest one. I won't go into talking more so about that, as we will have a con section to follow, but I did find his kind of manic nature somewhat interesting. He definitely employs this whole thing where he's got like a locked cage. He asks you to do puzzles.
Yeah.
He's like, you describe him like the Riddler. I think that's a good example. Yeah, he's almost Joker Riddler like. Thinks of himself quite highly, I imagine.
Yes.
In a narcissistic way, but in reality, he's actually just a nuisance to our character at this point. I'd be curious if anyone who played the game would to disagree with that, if they found him compelling. But he is terrifying to an extent, but I found him less so than the others.
Yeah, I found him to be like a pathetic nuisance. I wanted to get him out of the way. And of course, he's putting the girls in danger. And I just needed him out of the way and to save the girls. And I think that's a cool, interesting direction. And his area is kind of fun with the whole, like I said, the saw traps and the whole backroom Boulder Dash feeling to it. So, yeah.
There's also the barn, right? Is that correct? There's a barn that he has. That boss fight you have with these two big fat oozing zombies.
Yeah. We're gonna get into that in cons, I think.
Okay.
As far as my opinion goes in terms of that boss fight. So now we're into my favorite chunk of the game. I think one of the most compelling parts of the game.
Surprisingly, as well.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually expect this to be one of my favorite footnotes of the game. We have this place that we next go to, which is outside of the Arkham area, which is, I guess, probably one part of why it's such a breath of fresh air. It almost feels like its own game. It's a sea-wrecked ship, a very huge one at that, with multiple stairs reaching, I'd say, 5 to 6 floors, but you can't access all of them. I think some of them are blocked, but it is absolutely and utterly infested, and it seems to be the case that it's been, of course, wrecked. So you've got zombies that have been there and unfortunately gone that way, where you've got the fucked up ones, and you've got an elevator that's out of order. And from an atmospheric point of view, to focus on our theme and talking about that, it is terrifyingly more so than at least Lucas's section. It's a nice break, a nice change for me. And I found one thing to say is just I found the whole exploration of this thing to be just riveting. It was just such a unique and terrifying experience.
Yeah, it was
just to kick us off.
It was like a concentrated shot about what makes Resident Evil good. It had all of the greatest elements chucked into one mission, pretty much, where you had the ship environment where you had to use tools to open up new areas, and you had to kind of circumnavigate dangerous ones, whilst you have an objective to do as well, which is to find the girl. Plus, it's the way I would put it is that the best moments of the game are the main house with Jack and this part of the wrecked ship. And there's like a duality there, in the sense that there's the survivors, which is Ethan in the main house area, that is the perfect example of like good Resident Evil design. And then there's the corporate, the conspiracy corporate umbrella side with Mia, whilst including also the best of Resident Evil. And so it's like the best of Resident Evil from both perspectives, corporate and survivor. And it's a cool little duality. Okay, so that kind of covers what we think was great about the game. This is our pros of the game. We're going to give a little summary now. So, what we think is the most special about the game is absolutely the boss fights and how they introduced a layer of emergent gameplay and how they also characterize the terror that these villains portray in different ways. You have Jack, where he's like this unstoppable object. You have Margaret, with her mobility and her screechy voice. You have Lucas the Nuisance, and finally you have Evelyn, which is the grandma. And yeah, I think that's one of the key things which makes this game special, which is the creativity and excitement of the boss fights.
Then you've got the environments that you explore, like the main house, which definitely grabs my attention, being claustrophobic, and spiraling into mayhem with loads of underground walkways and new rooms, and backtracking around for hours to find out just completely new things. And at the same time, you're doing this while being petrified and terrified. So it's all good fun. And then you got the corresponding later part of the game with this wrecked ship, which completely sets the game on its heels, and you get a whole new environment, which is utterly and utterly wrecked, shipwrecked place. It's just gory, disgusting, terribly terrifying place, but it's beautiful. It's well done, and it sets a nice duality of where you're going to be in this game. You're either going to be in the claustrophobic areas, going across each of the character points, or you're going to be in the wrecked ship later on. It's just so much to explore.
Yep, and finally the revival of survival horror and the introduction of good level design in a Resident Evil game again, and the actual desire to engage with the survival horror genre and make something good within it. Those I think are those three things are ultimately the best and most poignant parts about Biohazard. However, nothing is perfect, and now we are going to go into some of the cons that we have with this game. We're going to do it in the same way we've done it so far, which is we're going to cover the story, the mechanics, and the atmosphere. I think the biggest issue with this game is ultimately the story. Despite us saying that the simplicity does help propel everything, I also think that it's nothing special. It's literally the same story as Resident Evil 1 with extra steps, so there was absolutely no mystery beside Evelyn to the story. That's my view, at least. What do you think, Josh?
I agree. Except you said I think it's the most pertinent issue, but there is also a mechanical issue, an atmospheric mechanical / issue that we'll discuss later.
Okay.
But I'd say that the story overall, as you said, besides of course I don't think what we're talking about here is like the introduction, the intro, all of this groundbreaking components to the narrative, and the whole characterization of the individual enemies. What we're talking about is the overarching story, right? That just to clarify, that is what we are discussing.
I think the intro and the characterization falls within another category. I think in terms of the actual overarching narrative, I think it's a bit lazy and they could have done a bit more, in my opinion. Yeah.
Pretty much agree. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I agree. Yeah, I do agree. So I'd also say another issue the game has, at least for its story, is the character of Lucas. You kind of touched on it, right? Lucas and his environment, it is just essentially he doesn't have the same give and the same power as the other guys have. He almost comes across as that enemy that you've left till last because you just didn't not want to fight him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But this one's done, intuitively, intentionally. I actually feel like this whole issue with Lucas that I have could have been completely subverted if they had dealt with him first, if he was your first boss. But the problem then is, the heightened enjoyment of the intro of the game would then be not as high, of course.
Yeah.
So Lucas was an interesting character, but was not fully developed, I'd say. I don't know what they could have done differently. But
well, also the issue with Lucas's segment is the fact that they don't do anything narratively with it. It's just you need to save the girls, and he's a nuisance, and that's that. You don't find out anything about the world or etc. Right?
Right, or Lucas for that matter. I don't actually recall.
Yeah.
Specifically, why he wanted to. Why did he kidnap the girls? What was his intentions? It was to.
Just cause.
Again,
yeah.
it washes over me anyway.
Yeah.
And, I mean, naturally, I think it flows onto our next point about the kidnapping of the girls.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
is a choice that you make
Oh,
in the game, which we haven't discussed yet, but that's because it really is just the most weirdest point I'd have to argue is just where you have to choose who to save out of the two girls, and I find it completely unnecessary. And I understand they wanted to have two endings to the game, or perhaps some difference in the later part, but I didn't see the point of it. There was nothing that made me feel connected either way to make the choice. Like there was no reason why I would want to make any choice. Narratively, they haven't been a focus, except for Mia, which has been the whole game.
yeah.
Now that I say it, so why would you not choose Mia?
I think that's the most
Uh,
pertinent point. The choice to making the choice between Zoe and Mia is no choice at all, because Zoe's cool, sure, but the whole reason Ethan is there is to save Mia, and the whole reason he's gone through this fucking madhouse is to save Mia. You're not gonna just choose Zoe at the last moment for no reason. It felt like completely out of left field and pointless. And on top of that, the worst part is, if you do for some reason choose to save Zoe, she dies anyway in the same way that she dies if you pick Mia. So it feels like the only thing it changes is that there's two endings. But it's just a very weird choice to have this this set of this like quandary that they force you to go through. So yeah.
we'll have to discuss this in our future episode about choices, I'm sure.
Yes.
We're going to do an episode later about choices in video games and how they matter or don't. And
Yeah.
anyhow, I think that is, for me, my conclusion to the story, critiques of the story, really.
Yeah. Only further thing is the ending is a bit lukewarm, but I think that's more of a atmosphere issue. So I think we should move on to our cons with the mechanics now.
One point immediately comes to mind is there is a lack of clarity in the balancing of weaponry. Now, there's some bosses you kind of have to use the rocket launcher, the shotgun.
Sure.
Nevertheless, I mean, it does make sense in practice, but there is still, while there is a huge diversity of weapons, I'd say you've got a flamethrower, for example, you've got a large array of weapons to use. Only a few of them are actually worth upgrading, or you can upgrade really, but it's just like, again, there's certain, it's hard to explain in words, but there's certain times you'll use certain weapons basically. So it doesn't really provide you with that variability that they maybe wanted to do.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately the point is that there's a huge weapon pool and huge diversity of weapons, but there's no point on Earth to use all of them. You're gonna stick to a few ones which are effective and ones which are necessary for certain bosses. You're gonna have the grenade launcher for like one specific boss, and then you're just gonna stick to the shotgun pretty much for the most of the time. And it's like, why would you make this diverse set of weapons if only a few of them are worth a damn? And yeah, I think that's a classic Resident Evil issue. It's always been the case. So yeah.
Yes, and you're touching on a very good point. I think it's a criticism overall to the inventory management, and the crafting comes along with it. It's just you can't carry them all. You have, at the end of the day, the game doesn't need to be all about as many weapons as possible, but flexibility in a game is always a good thing, I think I'd argue. I can't think of a time it wouldn't be. And giving the player the ability to choose when and how they want to approach situations is useful from a gameplay perspective, and limiting it is not. So I'd argue that they could have been they could have tried to improve upon some of the other issues, like with upgrading weapons and maybe just making the weapons have more utility in general at certain points.
Yes.
But
well, I know that this is an issue that you had with the risk of having not enough items and having not enough crafting materials in some important parts of the game. This is particularly a thing that happens in harder difficulties, right? So could you go over that a little bit?
Okay, so this is the argument. Okay, in a survival game, there's always the risk that you won't have the resources to progress. Especially in this game, I found it to happen to me twice. On Marguerite's chapter with the flamethrower, trying to kill the bug's nest, which are kind of important to kill them. Otherwise, you take a hell of a lot of damage and you can't get through. Flamethrower ammunition is expensive and hard to find. And I'm telling you, you got to believe me on this. You're probably going to say, Josh, you just didn't explore enough, you didn't loot enough. I'm telling you I did. I was having too much fun with the flamethrower and I was shooting it everywhere. That's what I did wrong. But I did not have the ammunition from the flamethrower to get through, and there was a point where I felt like I was actually stuck. And I feel like, yes, the game needs to be punishing, but the balancing, basically there's a debate like, should you give excess resources for balance purposes, or should you actually make it too difficult? This is kind of what I wanted to talk about earlier.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a slight criticism to these kind of games. This one as well.
Yeah, it's a debate because for Resident Evil purists like me, it's like that's the whole point. It's you have a limited inventory and you have to be clever about how you utilize that inventory, and clever about when you use your items because otherwise you get punished. And I think that's the whole point, is that you have to engage with the game actively, and not just coast through it, or you'll be punished and end up in a situation which is hard. I will say that it's better here than in Resident Evil 1, for example, on the hardest difficulty, because in the OG games, if you don't play it right, you could actually end up in a place where it's almost impossible to progress. Like, you've actually fucked up and need to start again, or hopefully you have an earlier save. Whilst here, I feel like you can kind of soldier on through it if you get in those situations. But at the same time, I see your point, or the other side of the view, which is that perhaps it shouldn't be that serious a punishment, because ultimately everybody makes mistakes sometimes, especially newcomers to the series, and there should be a way to get out of that. However, I will say that you were a newcomer, right, and you chose hard difficulty, right? I feel like maybe
Played it properly.
you should have maybe no. I'm saying maybe you should have just chosen normal difficulty instead of hard difficulty, because that wouldn't happen on normal. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I still think, actually, for me, the answer is I prefer the harder version because it just makes the game more terrifying, and you're just more immersed. It adds to it.
Yeah.
I fuck it. If you find the game hard, it's your problem. Honestly, if you waste your ammo like I did when a flamethrower, again, it's my problem. So that's my view. I think it's a good thing, actually.
Okay.
I think there is a debate though.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless.
Cool. Another con for me, it kind of bothered me a little bit, is that whilst there's a lot of really creative puzzles, and I think the design of them is pretty cool, they are all very simple in my opinion. Like, it's always kind of immediately obvious what you need to do to solve the puzzle. This is another debate. Some people hate puzzles that you're stuck on for like a very long time, or that are mechanically difficult. But I enjoy when puzzles can stump me sometimes. I like to feel dumb sometimes and have to actually like kind of claw my way out of a hole if I don't know how to solve. And this game doesn't really have any puzzle which is too complicated, in my opinion. They're all kind of very simple. That's a minor gripe that I have. Did you find it to be the same?
Look, Pete, I completed Portal 2, so I can safely say that puzzles for me, love them. So I think I found the shadow ones to be the most difficult, actually, because I couldn't rotate my analog sticks in the appropriate way. I was like, oh damn, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right.
Yeah.
I found I said this to you before. I found the Lucas's kind of whole device he created and set up with the clown, with the water and the cake, and you got to light the candle by getting through. That was the most interesting and laid out component to a puzzle, but it was very simple.
Yeah,
everyone who plays this game will figure it out.
Yes, there were no head scratchers.
There's no head scratches. There's nothing that just you have to Google and spend years trying to figure out. But
yeah,
you do want your puzzles to actually be like actually difficult. Otherwise, they are just a filler. It reminds me of like Spider-Man when you got QuickTime events.
Yeah,
no one likes those things.
Yeah,
there needs to be actual puzzles, for goodness sake. So maybe, I mean, in Village they were not much of an improvement.
No, no, they weren't.
It's for a later episode, I suppose.
Yes.
And then the last thing I think that we had to talk about was just the whole last Jack boss fight, which felt quite uninspired, and really, as surprising as it was to see Jack again in his final form, being the Charizard that he was. Unfortunately, he was just an ice speckled thing.
Yeah.
And really, to me, it signals okay, look, wouldn't it be cool if we brought Jack back later as some crazy blob, and the players like shocked about it? Which I appreciate. The idea was shocking, but it's just like, why don't you bring Jack back as something slightly more creative? That would have been great. But yeah, that was pretty much it. That whole barn fight was a bit meh. But
I agree. I also I didn't really like the the barn fight where Lucas sends the two roided out fuckers to attack you, because it was like really easy and very kind of boring in my opinion. When you're in the barn and Lucas sends two big
The two,
fuckers.
yeah.
I thought that was kind of
Yeah.
lame. So just two boss fights which were a bit meh. Yeah.
This is the most critical point of the game, right? I think. Besides story, there's the molded, the
Yes.
repetitive and overly used
Okay.
enemies
Yeah.
that exists and lurk around. And as you just said on the previous point, the barn fight with Lucas, they've got like these two zombies that are huge. I found them to be the same. It's just the substance of the enemies. They're just so repetitive, and
Yes.
that's unfortunate because they really do detract from the fear factor and the intrigue. They are just as boring as they come. There is slight variation where they crawl, which I thought was like, fair enough, they crawl. That's kind of cool, but that's really it. That is literally it.
Yeah, yeah.
For the hours and hours you'll play this game.
That was one of the biggest issues I had, is that outside of the main villains, the bosses, the cannon fodder, or the zombies, the little guys in between, they kind of suck because they all look the same. They were these molded guys. And towards the end of the game, all you have is a large chunk where you only fight these guys. And it's just really boring, really uninteresting. And it really dragged everything down. I think it was the biggest issue with the game besides the generic story. And it, as we'll talk about in the next episode, they kind of tried to fix it with Village, but not as much as they could have. So, yeah.
Okay, we're coming on to our last few points. What do we have left? We have the salt mine.
I didn't like the salt mines because it just turned into an action shooter that wasn't that mechanically interesting. You lost the whole level design. There was no more environmental puzzle. You just were running around shooting the most uninteresting enemies in the game, which are the molded. And it was a very boring looking environment too. It was just a salt mine that looked repetitive, and it made it feel, instead of making the ending of the game feel special, it made it feel like I kind of just want to get the game over with, which is unfortunate for such a good game.
Lastly, we kind of just mentioned this overall in the atmosphere discussion, but after Marguerite's death, after you defeat her, the whole game really just kind of goes a bit more on a meh side. But that notwithstanding, the shipwrecked section is very interesting, I thought. But overall, it's just that there's a drop in quality. It feels like the game maybe is a little too long. But yeah, that's basically my my conclusion on this. That's really it. Other than that, I love this game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just it didn't manage to necessarily keep all of its intensity and insanity until the very end, which is something I was hoping they would fix with Village, but they didn't really fix that with Village either. So I think that was the episode for us today. Unless you have something to add, tune in for our Resident Evil Village episode where we're gonna go over that in the same amount of detail.